When did you know that you were ready to do your own thing, to become an entrepreneur? Do you remember that moment?
I do, but it was actually twice. And unfortunately, and I'm not trying to throw my mom under the bus or anything else under the bus. I grew up in a time when there was no internet. There was no influencers. And I did grow up in a time, and I think this is still a little bit like this today, but not so much, where, as I alluded to before, the general talk track for success was you need to be a doctor or a lawyer. You need to get a real job. And so I started, my first company that had success was Quality Publishing, which was the government auction guides in the back of Car and Driver, Playboy magazine. 16 years old, I was buying ads in Playboy magazine because I knew people that wanted to buy cars on the cheap read that magazine, right? So I sold the government auction guides that were $19.99 in the back of that. This was all going well. In that paid for me to get into college. In college, I had Pendulum Sportswear and Design, which Bill Kitchen, who owned the Sky Coaster and all the amusement parks, gave me his customer list. I would sell T-shirts to Six Flags, Disney, ThyssenKrupp, which was Viking Land in Norway. I had good businesses going, but in the back of my head, I always thought, and this was a mistake, fine. I always thought you got to get a real job. So that's when I graduated college. I sold Pendulum to a company called Golden Squeegee, sold the whole T-shirt business. And that's when I worked at ADP. Now, you're asking me, when did you figure out? I had already figured out that I could be an entrepreneur. Here's where I started to get really frustrated, is the more they put me through corporate training, the more I read a book that they told me to read, the more I was like, 90% of this has to be written by somebody who never had to sell for a living, right? Like a lot of the stuff I was reading, I was like, this is really good in a vacuum, right? Like if we're actually running a car on a racetrack, what they're not accounting for is the other cars rubbing into you, the fact that there's going to be marbles on the road and the heat of the track. Like the stuff, like some of this stuff was like, what stage is your deal in? And I looked at that as somebody who had mentors since 8 years old that were doing huge deals. They never once, maybe I missed it, but never once in those conversations was a gentleman like a Bill Kitchen telling me, hey, this is a stage 3. This is in the deep analogous stage. It was a flow. Bill was in a flow state. Bill was figuring out what was important to that client. Why was that important to them? Bill was articulating how his invention could help that amusement park get them to that additional 13 million in top line revenue. He never once said, man, I'm going to make a follow-up call. He never even once said the words follow-up. He would say things like, does it make sense to get the agreement started so we can get the new Sky Coaster built there at MGM Grand? He never said, I'm following up to see if you want to spend $3 million on a ride at MGM. Right? So all of the stuff that I was learning, no disrespect to ADP, I love them. They're great. I set records there. I'm sure a lot of them still stand today. And they paid a lot of money and they put me through some great training. But it was about 80-20. I was only using about 20% of their stuff. I was using 80% of my stuff. Okay. And what I started to notice was the more I had to lean into other companies' sales programs, sales coaching, whether internally or externally, the more I felt like I had anchors on. And the more what I was missing from those coaches and those programs was it was all what, and there was very little how. And more importantly, Bart, there was zero why. Nobody was why. Why do you say this? Why do you do this? Why do you act calmly when they say this? There was none of that. So I went through a long career. We won't get into it. Worked for a lot of companies, including the American Customer Satisfaction Index was at the highest level there. And then finally, I was like, enough is enough. I need to just take all of this information that I have and I synthesize that down into what's eastonuniversity.com now. And now, fortunately, I get to spend my time on private coaching sessions. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I go live with all of my students there. We're always adding stuff to the portal.